Welcome to Keepin It Rural. Hey, it's Natasha.
I'm Becca.
And this is Lindsay.
We're here to give you a transparent view into rural life and agriculture.
All things small town America.
And leaving you with positivity and sunshine with a hint of sarcasm.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Keepin It Rural. We're so excited. Becca and we have a fantastic guest today, and I was really lucky enough to see Denneal talk at a Center for Food Integrity conference a long time ago, and she just intrigued me so much with her knowledge of genetic modification and biotechnology. She knows way more than I think I will ever know in my life. And she is the biotechnology director for UC Davis. All right, so I want to just get going because I am chomping at the bit to learn today with everybody else that's listening. First of all, tell us a little bit about you and what your role is with UC Davis. And then you can roll right into what have you seen with biotechnology and how it's changed our food system up until today.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm pretty excited to be here. So just going way back for me is I'm half Irish, and I grew up hearing a lot about the potato famine and about the importance of being able to feed populations. And so I was really interested in agriculture from a young age, even though I grew up in the city. So I'm more of a city slicker. I wasn't keeping it rural as a child, but I heard a lot of stories from my grandparents about, their rural life in Ireland. And, as I grew up, went to college. I went to UC Davis to get a degree in biology. I did some work in a lab that was looking at weed science and learned about genetics and plant genetics. And so I got very interested in GMOs when I was in college, and I went on to do a PhD in genetics at UC Davis. And now I'm the director of the biotech program. So I've been following this space for, about 20 years or so. And I'm very much a pro technology person. So how we can use technologies to improve farming, to improve, production of animals and make our food healthier, more nutritious. I'm very open to all the different possibilities. So that's where I'm coming from. And what I've seen with GMOs over the last, 10 years in particular, is a switch from doing everything transgenically, which is what we would be calling GMO today. And that would be moving big pieces of DNA around to try and make a better corn or make a cow more meaty or whatever you're trying to do. And now it's a little more subtle. The changes that are being done genetically are called gene editing crops or animals, is making, a couple changes here or there in the genome to make these trait changes. And that's not really regulated or considered as GMO because it's very similar to a lot of old traditional techniques where you'd be doing mutagenesis or kind of trying to identify diversity in a pool of parents and making crosses. So I would call that more now precision breeding or, genomic assisted breeding. And I think that because we had a lot of issues early on trying to get GMOs to market with a lot of consumer concerns and pushback, the techniques have been changed a little over the last few years. But otherwise, I would say, I think that these technologies are going to continue to be used. They've been good and important in terms of securing our food supplies and allowing us to study and understand, crops and animals, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I love the precision breeding thing. It makes it sound like we've really capitalized and grown in our knowledge and use of things such as genetics.
Yeah, so the things on the market today, actually this year, 2022, we have the new label that needs to be on packages if there's bioengineered food inside. So bioengineered is now the label that is the GMO label that's on packages. And there's only 12 bioengineered crops in the United States that would be in your marketplace. And it's mainly soybeans and corn, but also, canola, the derived oil from canola, sugar beet sugar. There's papayas and squash that are virus resistant, alfalfa, which we aren't eating, but cows would consume, cotton, some apples and potatoes that are non-browning and have a few other little traits in them, and some eggplants and pink pineapples. There's not that much on the market that would be considered bioengineered, but anything that has any of those components in it will be labeled now. And we do have one animal, it's the Aqua Advantage salmon that is on the market. But other than that, anything else has been bred either with precision breeding, mutation breeding, or other tools that are not considered bioengineered.
And how much research was done on those items you just listed that are on the market? Like, how long does it take for something to get from an idea that somebody thinks of to actually people are eating it?
Back when this was the main way of doing things, I would say it took years because they had to do a lot of initial concept and then a lot of the genetic engineering, a lot of testing. There's oversight for all biotech crops by 3 agencies. So the USDA, the FDA, and the EPA work together in this coordinated framework to oversee any kind of transgenic products that are brought to market. And so I think the development of the technologies and then the regulatory piece that came afterwards, if you put those 2 things together, it took several years and probably sped up to the point more recently where it could have maybe be done in a handful of years, 2 to 3-ish at the fastest. But because, you've got breeding seasons and cycles of planting and looking at the next generation and all that, it hasn't been a super fast process. And I think gene editing is exciting for people because it is a little bit faster on the downstream end. And there isn't that really long drawn out regulatory piece. I think that, we might start seeing some more interesting products soon. And they won't necessarily have the label on them. But, if you find something in the supermarket that's got a different color, very purple tomatoes or, things that have some different traits, hopefully the producers will advertise that and really promote the fact that we're bringing a better product to market. And here's how it's better. This is how we made it, and consumers can get that education up front.
On that education note, I think nutrition is a big concern for people when we talk about GMOs. I mean, my kids even in school ask about like the taste of apples, and they're like, why are Red Delicious so gross? They all have this perception that Red Delicious have always had this weird taste to them, but it's my mom's favorite apple. And so when we talk about taste or nutrition, those things can be enhanced and improved through biotech, right?
Yeah, I think there's not that many products that have come to market in the past yet that have that quality aspect. So most of the GMOs on the market, or the traditional GMO bioengineered crops like soy and corn, they were bred or engineered, I should say, to have crops that help with agronomic characteristics. So it means they're easier to farm, they're pest resistant, you can spray the weeds around them, kill the weeds, but don't kill them. And, they have these agronomic characteristics. The first quality crops that maybe had a different consumer appeal were the non-browning apples and potatoes. And those were, maybe 2015 or 16 or so. That wasn't that long ago that they were coming out. I think in the future, you will see some attention paid to how do you engineer and manipulate the characteristics that more to do with flavor and aroma and texture. I know what you're saying about those Red Delicious apples. The texture of them is a little grainy. That was bred regular. That's traditional breeding that led to those different apple varieties. So the only apple on the market that I know of that has any kind of engineering to it are the Arctic apple brand. So everything else is just traditionally bred.
And I remember hearing you talk about that Arctic apple. I don't even know what I was listening to because I am weird and look up your stuff sometimes. You had talked about how the apple, you had just took a bite out of it and sat it there, and the next day it looked the same.
Yeah, so what I did is I was able to get some apples for sampling for my class. So I had a biotech undergrad class and I was able to get a box of apples and we cut them up and left them out on plates. And, we had a regular apple and one of the non-browning ones. We observed the fact that the oxidation that happens with a regular apple, it starts to turn brown, didn't happen with the Arctic apples. And I think what you're remembering is I had given one to my son to take to school. I was like, here's this neat apple, see if you like it. I'm gonna put it in your lunchbox. And then at the time he was probably like in 2nd grade or something, and he didn't take his lunchbox out of his bag. So I literally found that apple like days later. It was a long while later and it was half eaten and it was in his lunchbox. And when I took it out, it looked pretty good actually, considering it had been in there for a while.
Right?
Yeah.
And when it wasn't kept chilled, I'm guessing that one.
No, it was like room temperature in his backpack in his room in a lunchbox. So I was like, wow, this technology, not only does it work like in a short period of time, like days later, the thing still looks relatively good.
In agriculture, I mean, we're really like farm kids and we grew up in rural areas where farming is our livelihood and such. So how do we work together in the food sector? Because I know you're very connected with that. And then the agriculture sector to help people understand biotechnology. What do you see as the change using, the new methods of biotechnology in food production? Is it going to be more consumer accepted? How do we work together to help people understand that biotechnology has a place in our food system?
I think it's really important to start young, right? So we have projects in our state. We have some nonprofits like California Ag in the Classroom, when we have the Center for Land-Based Learning, and we have lots of different agricultural education. 4-H, let's say, that's a big one. That's all over the place. The UC has our UC ANR cooperative extension specialists who work directly with farmers and producers to try to keep them up to speed on the latest technologies. So I think really the traditional education methods in classrooms and things are important, but like we're making a podcast right now, right? So social media and being able to find people that you would validate as, okay, this is an expert, this is an honest broker, they're not tricking me or telling me something weird, they're delivering factual information. I think that's going to be really important. So how do you teach your kids to find information online or through government websites or whatever, where you say, these are the experts, this is the truth, this is what's happening. So I think our kids are actually much more sophisticated at that than maybe some of our older folks. So
You're right.
so I'm not too worried about them being scared of technology. I think they're pretty open. They're more interested in technologies or, genetic engineering and those kinds of things than maybe previous generations have been. But I think explaining carefully what the difference is between different types of genetic engineering is important. I often tell people about mutagenesis. And
Yeah, because that's crazy stuff.
yeah, it's been used since the 1930s, right? You just radiation bombard some seeds or you soak them in something with chemicals in it that changes the DNA. And then you grow out the seeds, and most of them die because they're all mutated. But then some of them will keep going and they're like, oh, wow, that's different. Okay, let's check out the traits. So that's how we got ruby red grapefruit. That's how we got the barley that's used to make a lot of beer. And a bunch of the different crops have been bred with these old fashioned, very crude technologies where we were making big genetic changes, but we didn't really keep track of what those were. We just did it and we're like, oh, look, it's better. Okay, let's use it. So we've been doing that since the 1930s, and people don't realize most of our food supply already has been heavily manipulated that way. And so when you talk to them in the 90s about, oh, we're taking genes out of this one thing, we're going to shift them over here and pop it in there and make something different, that seemed really freaky. People were like, wow, what are you doing? But actually, we'd already been rearranging chromosomes and things like that for a while, just crudely and not knowing exactly what was happening.
Is it correct that mutagenesis changes sometimes hundreds?
Yeah, it is a big change. It's like you took a vase and you crashed it with a hammer and then you stuck it all back together with the pieces here and there. It's a big shuffle, right? Whereas genetic engineering and transgenesis is like you took a little chip off the vase and you glued it on somewhere else. It's very much more precise.
That is a great analogy.
Yeah. So from my point of view, being scared of moving that little chip around, but not scared that you shattered the whole thing and restuck it back together doesn't make sense to me, right? Because I'm a geneticist and I understand what happened, but most consumers don't understand that. They just know that, well, I've been eating this one thing for 50 years and it seems okay. So I trust that. But now you've got this new thing and I'm not so sure about that. So people are a little bit more broad in their assessment of risk and benefit. And so I think, you've got to make clear to the consumer, what is the benefit for you? Why is this thing tastier? Why is it more nutritious? Does it cost you less? That's a big thing. If the farmer doesn't have to put as much input into that, system, then the price point on the thing coming out is going to be less. There's just a lot of different components. And I think if you start teaching kids young about farming systems and food systems, that they can have a better understanding of how our whole system works. And it is very complicated. And every crop has got a whole different economic sort of pathway that it goes down. And in California, we have a lot of specialty crops, and there really aren't any GMO specialty crops. I think the only one I can think of is maybe the apples, if they came here, but I don't think we have any of those apples in California. And then pink pineapples are a specialty thing, but I don't think we're growing pineapples here either. There's not that much GMO in California. I would say possibly there were some tomatoes at one time, and we don't have those right now. And maybe the alfalfa, some canola, but yeah.
I think you can probably put this in a nutshell for us. So I don't want to get too deep in this, but I've been to, used to be Monsanto. I've been through the lab. They showed me like how they chip the corn thing and they do other things. What I still don't really understand, Becca probably does, but how do you actually change the gene? Like, how do you actually get it in there and make it do its thing?
So one thing that people didn't realize about Monsanto either, and they've since been bought by Bayer, so that's Bayer Crop Science, but with that whole chipping thing they were doing, that was to aid precision breeding. So they take a little scrape off the seed and then they genome sequence it or look for specific genes to see which genes does this seed have. And they would only keep the ones they wanted for breeding the next round, and then they'd toss out all the other ones. It was more to manage like greenhouse space and where you focus your attention on breeding. And then they would just breed them regular. They would be like, we got the ones with the genes we want, and now we're going to cross those ones and keep going. And they bred, I would say, I think I was told half their business was growing organic seeds. They had a big footprint in both the what you considered biotech seeds and the organic seeds. And that was with precision breeding and just genomically knowing what are the genes inside this plant. Well, what is that maybe going to do to the traits of the plant? It's very data heavy. And I didn't bring this up, and I should mention it, that the only reason we have as much biotech today in food as we do is because genome sequencing, DNA sequencing got very cheap. It got inexpensive and fast. So there was a big revolution over the last 10, 20 years of barely being able to sequence a gene, and it took a long time and it was extremely expensive, to, wow, we can do this quick. We'll just drop this little chip of a seed in here, and a few hours later, we know the genome, and it was cheap. So we can do that now. And that's mainly because the government invested in the Human Genome Project. So the same machinery and know-how that allows human genome sequencing also allows plant and animal sequencing. So that has gotten very fast. So that allows us to be much more precise in how we're doing things now than, 50 years ago with our mutation breeding and all that. I can only imagine it's just going to get more and more precise. And, I don't know if I answered all of your question. I'm trying to remember.
Sometimes I don't get how you actually change it.
Yeah, because you can't see it. Think of it as Legos. So the DNA is like a stack of Legos, all these different colors, whatever, and you got to crack it in some place and take that block out and stick it back together, and then move that block over somewhere else and break that one open and stick it in. So it's an actual physical process. The way that we do that is with enzymes. Enzymes are little proteins that can cut DNA at specific places. And we found the enzymes way back in the 70s in bacteria. And they were used by bacteria as a defense system against viruses. So viruses will infect bacteria. And when that viral DNA or RNA actually comes in, the enzymes would chop it up so that it couldn't make more viruses. Yeah, well, we have to do DNA sequencing to figure out what's being broken. So what pieces are being broken and how big are they now? So this is the basis of cloning, which got all figured out in the 70s and early 80s. But it's actually a physical thing that happens. You can think of the DNA as, like I said, like a string of bricks stuck together, and you make a break and you pull a piece out, you can stick a piece in, stick it back together. But it's all happening at the molecular level, and it's atomically happening. So there's actual bonds being made between atoms and broken. That's why they call it molecular biology. So
Yes.
That's cool.
It is. It's stinking awesome. And this precision that you talk about that we've achieved through genetics, how is that impacting our food system, and how will it impact the food system in the future? Because like you said, we've been doing this since the 1930s through even some crude methods that no one even realized. And how has that impacted us to this current point? And where is this precision going to take us?
Yeah, what's next?
Yeah.
The what next stuff. I would say right now there's a huge push to understand what microbes are associated with which plants and animals, and how are those microbes helping those plants and animals be more healthy, resist disease, be drought tolerant, or whatever. And so we know that there are effects on humans and animals based on what microbes are in your gut, and that your gut health is important. Same thing for livestock and chickens and whatever. Also for plants, there's microbes associated with the roots. And so because we can DNA sequence a lot of things now, you can take a sample of soil or a piece of root or a little scraping out of a gut or whatever, and you can sequence it and figure out, okay, what kind of microbes are in there? And then you can try to figure out which ones are doing good, which ones are doing not so well for this organism. If you can come up with a recipe, like a yogurt or something that has the good beneficial microbes in it, you could feed that to livestock, or you could coat a seed in microbes that helps it to fend off, disease, or be more drought resistant or whatever.
That's cool.
Yeah. So that's one thing. Another thing is just we can do precision breeding really fast now. So if you can identify a trait and figure out why is it a good trait for this crop or this animal, you can easily try to figure out how to breed the ones you want. So that speeds that up. And gosh, I don't know. There's just a lot we don't understand yet about biology because it's very complex, but we're trying to look now more at systems biology. So all these different systems interact. So they're the microbes, they're on the plant is in the soil. What kind of soil is it? So it's very data intensive when you're trying to track all those different things and figure out the interplay between them in a farming system. So I think that's where we're headed, this bigger complexity. And I will just add that I have some colleagues working on projects funded by NASA and funded by agencies and organizations that want to understand how can you recreate these kinds of complex systems in closed systems. So if you're going to go to Mars, you're not going to bring a herd of cattle to Mars, right? You probably can bring some seeds, maybe you can bring a little something to make a hydroponic system, but chances are you're not going to be able to fully transport a whole farming system someplace. So how do you make a closed system that mimics or has some of those same components so that people can live in harsh climates or harsh places and still be able to produce food? And that kind of leads me to one of the other topics that I was going to mention today, which is cultivated meat, cultivated proteins, vertical farming, hydroponic systems. So bringing what we know about nature indoors and trying to set up systems that can recycle water, that can be really efficient at producing food in places where you can't actually do the traditional methods.
You had mentioned in some of our conversations about the biosensing and precision agriculture. And I think there's cows that wear data monitors, right? Is that kind of what biosensing is? And like, what else do you use that for? And then how does precision agriculture work into some of these crop production practices with biotech?
Yeah, so I think that data science is a big part of this. So we have robots and sensors that can get out in the fields and cover more ground than a farmer can or a producer in one day. And take a look at, what are the moisture in the soil, how much photosynthesis is going on in a field. Cattle and other livestock can wear sensors that can tell you things about their metabolic state or their reproductive state, or whether they're sick or not, or if they have a fever, or their heart rate. You can measure all kinds of things on animals using these sensors. And I know there's something called, I think, the quantified cow, where they have an ear tag that actually can measure those types of data. And then, if you have a large herd of animals, you're not going to be able to pay close attention to each one. But if you're feeding that data into a spreadsheet and you have some sort of cutoff value where you go, that one has a problem, let me go check it. You can look for that specific animal to check on it, versus trying to wander around through a herd or kind of look at them as they come in and be like, yeah, is everybody looking okay? So I think it's just a more detailed way, more data-driven way to make efficiencies and make sure that you have a healthiest possible livestock system or farming system. And those same kinds of ways of thinking can be applied to indoor systems, vertical systems. So it's a lot about trying to monitor the flow of nutrients, the flow of energy, temperatures, and all of those kinds of things that go into producing food.
So I want to know more about cultivating meat.
Yeah, let's put it out there.
I know some stuff. I've read the book Clean Meat. I know Paul Shapiro pretty well. So he does some stuff with our students here and talks to them about things. And he has the Better Meat Company in California. So I'm just really interested to know on the biotech side, what are they working on to scale that? And then is it something that will be economical? Is it something that you think it's gonna happen?
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying I think it is going to happen. I don't think that it's going to overtake our entire food production system, but I think it'll be a significant piece, probably in urban centers, right? I think what's going to happen ultimately in our lifetimes is that, traditionally raised meat or whatever is going to be premium and it's going to cost a lot. It's going to be like, this is the real deal. And then most of what we eat on a regular basis is probably going to come out of these fermentation systems, I think. I could be wrong. The reason that I think that is because we have some limitations on land and on resources, on water and energy. So I've seen some predictions and things that it might be more efficient to get proteins for food in some fermentation systems. So I will say I've eaten a Better Meat Company slider. I've eaten some of that product, which is like a kind of a mycelium. It's like a fungal type product. Yeah. And it's very good. It tastes delicious. It tastes fine. And it didn't give me a stomach ache or anything. So I was like, this is pretty cool. Okay. If this was less than a regular hamburger, I'd probably buy it because it tastes fine and it's like full of protein. And if you talk to Paul, I think he'll tell you, he has a whole spiel about how terrific it is, but it has a lot of iron and it has a lot of nutritional qualities as well. In terms of cultivating meat, I'm working with some faculty at UC Davis. I'm the co-founder of our Cultivated Meat Consortium, and they're trying to figure out, it's still very early days in terms of the economics of all of this. They're trying to figure out how to make cheaper media because you have to feed the cells. And these cells are like stem cells, right? So you take a biopsy of an animal, you have those little meat cells, and then you're trying to make more of them and grow them and feed them. And there's not great ways of doing that yet. I think Upside Foods in Emeryville has just opened a big facility. And I think they're making chicken breasts with growing out the cells. There's some places like Good Meat, which is part of Eat Just. They've been selling like a chicken nugget type product in Singapore. Currently in the United States, there's not any of the cultivated meat on the market. There's these other products like Better Meat Company or Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger, which are more plant-based or fungal-based. But the actual taking a biopsy from an animal, growing that up and selling that, I don't think that's been on the market yet because the regulatory is not done yet. So we're still coming up with the rules of how you monitor that for safety, nutrition, quality, and all of that. And it'll be done. Those kinds of things will be generated in factories, basically. So big bioreactors within a larger factory system, which biotech knows how to do. That's how we all make vaccines and medicines, cancer medicines and everything. So we know how to do that. It's just that, how do you do that cheaply? So that's the big question. So we don't really know yet, like the fully, elaborated costs on all of this. I have a feeling it'll be expensive for a while. We very well could improve technologies to the point where it's not that expensive.
How efficient is it in terms of the inputs that we would normally have in a livestock production, water, energy, feed, all of those things?
That's not my area of expertise. I would say that from the numbers that are published by groups that have looked into it, it seems pretty efficient in terms of water and energy inputs, or like feeding the cells versus feeding a cow. Mm-hmm. However, I have some questions about, we get a lot of other products from cows and whole animals. So we get the bones, we get the leather, we get other pieces, right? So what's the balance there? Like, how many regular cows do you need versus how many pipelines of meat production do you need to feed everybody and still keep all of the products that we have and all of the supply chains and things? So I don't think that's been fully worked out yet. And I'm very open-minded about the fact that we need to investigate that. The other thing that I'll mention, this is a little bit of a downer, but I think that it's true. You got to think about this in terms of national food security. Look at Ukraine. They're under attack. If they had all of their meat production in a factory in the middle of Kiev, you think that wouldn't have already been blown up? So if you look at the United States, we have very distributed production of food across very big land mass. And so if you concentrate all your food production into a few points, a few nodes, that's a risk. I haven't heard anybody talk about that, but that's something that I think about.
That is a really good point.
So the Ukraine is a breadbasket, and they have all these fields that won't be planted, but the fields will still be there. I think there's some things we need to think about as a society about how much do we want to concentrate and condense our food production into certain areas. Will they be secure? Will our electrical grid be secure, or whatever energy is supplying these factories? The water supply, municipal water supplies, all of those kinds of things have to be thought about very carefully in terms of infrastructure. So I'm not going to say that it won't happen, that we'll shift heavily that direction, but I do think there's so much to think about, that we're in very early stages on a lot of these.
I once heard you say, one of the times I was listening to you talk about something, who knows what, you had talked about how a mistake of naming GMOs was the mistake of naming them GMOs. And it became this thing that was negative, where if you would have called it transgenic, like mutagenesis, that it would have been a different conversation. So what are the conversations you're having in biotech about what do we call these technologies that are coming up?
One conversation is about calling it cultivated meat versus clean meat. So there is an element within our technology group that's developing cultivated meat who are very concerned about animal welfare and about, just more of an ethical treatment of animals sort of position. And so they coined a phrase, clean meat, and a lot of people are using that. But that sort of implies other people growing livestock are dirty meat, right? It's a little bit insulting, and it's not very good if you're trying to bring together everyone under one tent and say, how can we best produce food for the most number of people most sustainably? So I think we like to stay away from terms that carry any kind of heavy baggage in terms of cultural connotations, like, oh, this is the dirty meat over here, ours is the clean meat, right? We want to say, hey, listen, so there's lots of ways to produce meat. Everybody needs meat. We need proteins of some sort. So maybe you don't need meat, but you might need pea protein or whatever. You need protein. So let's not demonize any particular technology, and let's make sure that we just look carefully at all of the ramifications of using the different technologies and come up with the most logical way that we can use our resources, whether that's electricity, water, time footprint. If you build factories, you're going to use concrete and steel. You're going to put concrete on the ground. So how much of that do you want to do? Does that have an impact? So there's all of these things you really need to think carefully about. And I don't believe in demonizing technologies. I think every technology that humans put forth has a good side and a bad side, right? Every single thing. And you've got to be really careful about how you evaluate what you're going to use and where, right? Could be different places need different things. So
is there anything that exists on store shelves today that is the original way it was found on this earth?
probably berries. I think like berries and a lot of mushrooms, maybe like game animals, if you can find rabbit or deer.
Kind of as nature intended without
Maybe fish, like fresh caught ocean
yeah.
fish, shrimp and crustaceans and things like that. But basically stuff you can hunt or fish or pick out in the wild is probably roughly the same as it was.
Everything in the store likely is some kind of a technique.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Human beings have figured out how to live well. Our ancestors didn't live as well as we're living. They didn't have the variety of food that we have. So I feel really comfortable with how the US pursues agriculture and how we regulate things. I feel like we have a really good food supply compared to a lot of places in the world. And so that's why, I'm glad we are taking it slow and thinking through how we're going to be bringing these new technologies to market. But overall, I think we've had more successes than failures. And looking back at foods and stuff, you can think about maybe some food dyes and things in the past that weren't that good. Maybe they were carcinogenic or they had some other properties that we didn't know because that was the 1950s or whatever, and we were using those. But eventually, as we figure things out, we improve and improve. So I think that's a good system.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail right on the head when you talked about how we all need to play on that same team. At the end of the day, regardless of how your protein is produced, that it is still coming from a producer. And so how I think Tasha and I have talked about this countless times, like, why are we always fighting just because your farm does it differently than this farm, or this producer does it differently than this guy over here? And at the end of the day, we're working for a common purpose, and we're not going to get anywhere if we don't find that common ground. Going forward, is there anything that, from a science perspective, that producers of all types can benefit from or feel positive about in approaching this new and precision-based agriculture?
I would just say that work closely with policymakers. And so what you're talking about, the fighting or the kind of, that is market competition, right? So that's when one place says, my stuff's better than your stuff for these reasons. And you need to be science-based. And who's going to come in and say, listen, guys, these are the facts. This is the science. That's going to be the regulatory agencies and kind of the overarching, what our policies are as a society, as an entire collective. So we're going to need to enforce policy, I think, and to come up with good policies that are science-based. And then after that, let the market do its thing. If people want to buy all organic or only eat berries that fall off of bushes or whatever, that's fine with me. That everyone can choose to do what they want to do. I just think that making sure that all of our people can afford food and can get good quality, nutritious food is really critical. And that has to be a priority.
Yeah.
Oh, I totally agree. I totally agree. So just because we might have some young people listening to this podcast, if kids like science, what are the things that you think you should really think about biotechnology, or these are the things that are going to be happening in the next 10 to 20 years?
We've all just come through this big pandemic and, viruses are a thing, pathogens that are new that are traveling around the world because we all go on airplanes and travel around now. We've got a lot of people that need to understand how plants, animals, and people get sick and how to make them better. So I would say if you like agriculture, but you're more interested in the health side of things, maybe thinking about going into molecular biology or pharmacology, farm tox, and trying to figure out, how do the chemicals in our environment impact us, impact animals? How do they travel through the water or the soil? That's really important. I think people who go down the road that I went down, doing genetics and breeding, that's going to be important. People who understand ecosystems and how natural systems look, and just we've changed a lot of our ecosystems. I don't know that there's too many that are like completely natural anymore, but for the most part, just trying to keep a handle on what's happening with climate shifts, whether you believe to the extent of which that's man-made or not man-made, whatever, there are changes happening. So we're having more extreme weather, we have more floods, we have more droughts, we have some things happening. So how can you track and monitor those things? Can you give people warning? This is going to happen. We need civil engineers to build better systems for collecting water or diverting storm waters or whatever we need to do. At least in California, that's a huge concern, right? So some years we're flooding completely and other years we're just dry as a bone. And it would be great if during the flooding years we could figure out how to keep some of that water, or like just north of us, they're having a lot of rain up the coast, Oregon, Washington, they're flooding and we're dry. So I'm like, what can we build a pipeline? What can we do to get some of that water that they don't want? So I think there's just so many opportunities for young people to engage in agriculture, whether that's being a farmer or a livestock producer themselves, or becoming a scientist that investigates all of these other components that go into the system. That's going to be really important. And I didn't mention nutrition and food scientists, right? Making sure that people understand how to eat healthy is really important. And the US diet, I think, I just ate a bunch of carbs this morning. I have a carb problem. I know I do. But I think, we just all need to do a little better on our diet and exercise to stay healthy and reduce chronic diseases in the population. It's just a very rich and interesting environment for kids of all types who have lots of different interests to find something to do.
And food is just such an essential piece of health. And I think some people just dismiss it like it's not, but it is essential.
It's the critical piece, right? So if you don't have enough food or you don't have the right kind of food, your health is really terribly impacted. That's really important.
Absolutely. And I think you are such a good, a center point for kids who are looking at careers in this, because the kids I see on a daily basis as an ag teacher, I'd say 75 to 80% of them don't come from the country or a farm, and they're looking at these careers and saying, whoa, this is possible. And so we know that you didn't have that experience, but Denneal, we like to wrap up every show on Keepin' It Rural by asking, how are you keeping it rural?
Keeping it rural, I garden a lot. I've got, right outside my window here, I got bunches of pots. I got beans and peas and squash and tomatoes and all kinds of things.
You're an urban gardener.
I'm not feeding too many people, but maybe myself and my family. So
there you go.
Right. My garden does not feed, and I live in Minnesota, so I get my garden for 2 months out of the year. We only feed us as well. Great.
Yeah. Awesome. It's just refreshing.
Yeah, that's awesome. This has been so great. No matter when I talk to you or hear you speak, I am always amazed. So first of all, tell us all the places we can find more information about you and UC Davis and all the work that you guys are doing.
We have a biotech program website. And so if you take a look at that website, also, I really recommend you look at California Ag in the Classroom. They have a lot of good programming for kids that are elementary through high school. We also, our College of Ag and Environmental Sciences is a really great resource. So if you check out some of the neat work going on at UC Davis, we're one of the top ag campuses in the world and definitely in California. So there's so much going on here. I can't even keep track. And I'm very proud of my colleagues. They work really hard across all these different sectors. And, we engage with the wine industry and all kinds of specialty crops. So it's really a lot of fun.
Oh, it sounds so much fun. I'm glad that we have people like you doing that stuff. God did not give me these talents. So he gave me the talent to talk a lot, which I got in trouble a lot in school, but today it's a useful skill. Thank you so much. This was so fantastic. We appreciate so much you taking the time to chat with us and teach all our listeners about biotechnology.
Yeah.
You're very welcome.
All right. Thank you so much.
It's not a party without you there. Follow our crazy on Facebook and Instagram, and be sure to check out all episodes and extras at keepinitruralgirls.com.
Until next time, keep it rural.
It's time to pour on the fire and call in the dogs. That's all, folks.